Hello everyone, this is Cobalt. Today I'm going to be doing a very deep dive on the Dexterity stat. I'll be analyzing every light attack, aerial, recovery, and ground pound on every weapon on every available Dexterity for that particular weapon. This will be making some corrections to the Dexterity video that I released a little while ago. As always, if you're looking for details about a specific weapon, there are timestamps in the description. So, in the original video I posted, I was making a comparison between the highest dexterity in the game being 9 dex on Cassidy, and the lowest dexterity in the game being 2 dex on Nash. It seems like a reasonable comparison to make to me since they both use hammer. However, one thing that I didn't account for was the variation between different weapons or moves. In this video I only used downlight as a comparison point between the highest dexterity and the lowest dexterity because I incorrectly assumed that dexterity would have uniform impacts over every move in the game, which it in fact does not, as you will see shortly. Several of my viewers pointed out differences in weapons could alter the way that dexterity functions, and thanks to Bad Animation for pointing me in the right direction by providing me a link to some of this information on dexterity. I'll be linking it down in the description below, so feel free to view it if you want more information. So now, I'm going to be analyzing the light attacks on all weapons in the game. I'll be covering their startup, active frames, and first actionable frames. I'll also be covering the variations based on the dexterity stat. I wanted to start with some of the definitions of the terminology I'll be using whenever discussing these movesets. Startup frames refer to the amount of frames after a move has started before a hitbox is active. Active frames are the amount of frames that hitboxes are present that can make contact with an opponent. On miss refers to the move not making contact with an opponent, and on hit refers to the move making contact with an opponent. Lastly, FAF, or First Actionable Frame, refers to the amount of frames after the move has begun that the user is able to move again, or the total frames after end lag has happened. I've indicated the first actionable frame by the character jumping. Next, I'll address the difference that Dexterity makes. Dexterity is a stat that impacts the FAF or end lag of the moves. It has no impact on startup frames and no impact on the active frames of a move, which means that the startup of a move and the duration of the active hitboxes on the move are not impacted, and the only thing that changes based on dexterity is how much end lag each individual move has. Additionally, I've timed it to where the first active hitbox connects with the opponent. Because certain hitboxes cancel after they make contact, I figured this would be an appropriate uniform way to handle this. So, with all that said, let's get started. Oh, and one quick side note before starting. I was recently invited to be on the Gravity Cancel podcast hosted by the guys over at WorldHop, so a big thanks and shoutouts to Sergeant Spankcakes and Rocks for hosting and facilitating it. It'll be linked down in the description below if you guys want to hear more about me, my history with YouTube and competitive platform fighters, and future videos in a less scripted format. And please give their other videos a listen. They make some great content and discuss Brawlhalla in a very candid and fun format. Alright, now let's get started. Alright, so first up is the Almighty Hammer, which is still one of the best weapons in the game in my opinion currently. It's got really good kill confirm options, edgeguarding, and threatens against edgeguarding insanely well. There's a lot of top level play with Hammer, including Bodvar, Cassidy, Nash, Core. Now that I'm looking at it, every single Hammer Legend has been used at top level. Guess that speaks for itself then. Hammer Legends have dexterity values varying from 2 to 9. So on the screen here you can see two charts. The first displays the move's frame data on hit, and the second displays the move's frame data on miss. I'm not going to discuss every detail of this since there are 13 weapons, 8 attacks per weapon, and multiple dexterities for each move, which results in, well, a lot of numbers. Discussing every single move's frame data on every dexterity would take up an awfully large amount of time, so what I'm going to do is briefly discuss the general frame data adjustments based on the character's dexterity with these up in the background, and if you guys need to pause the video to view specific numbers for something in particular, you can. Also feel free to drop questions down in the comments below if something doesn't make sense or if you see that I've made a mistake. We can see on Hammer's kit several of the moves have different hitboxes or properties based on whether they miss or hit. Neutral Light converts into a third hit if it makes contact. Down Air and Recovery become command grabs, and Ground Pound's hitboxes cancel on the first one after making contact with the opponent, which is semi-common among the Ground Pounds honestly. All of the other moves yield the same active frames on miss as they do on hit. Now we'll take a look at what dexterity actually impacts, the FAF. On miss, we see that all of the FAF values go down as the dexterity values increase, but by a very minuscule amount. 4 frames of end lag are reduced at the most, and 2 frames of end lag are reduced at the least from these moves. This isn't a bad thing since it makes your moves slightly safer on miss, but I don't think that 2 or 4 frame differences on miss is worth sacrificing a stat in another category, honestly. Now, on hit is where things get a little bit different. There are certain moves on several weapons that have 0 variation in FAF between dexterity values. These are primarily contained to moves that function as combo starters. We can see that every move on Hammer's kit does lower in FAF as dexterity increases, with the exception of Downlight, which has an FAF of 22 no matter what dexterity you use. Other than downlight, however, the amount of end lag each move has is reduced by 2 to 4 frames. I'm not entirely sure which combos this will directly impact and how this would impact neutral, but the difference in frames is pretty low honestly, so I suspect that there would be some combos with tighter dodge windows certainly, and maybe even gain some true combos out of it, but considering Nash has some top level competitive representation, I'd wager it's not enough to make or break a character. I personally don't think that Dexterity is super necessary on Hammer. Downlight is Hammer's primary combo starter, and all of the combos that are out of Downlight are the same on every Dexterity since it has the same FAF on every Dexterity value. There are of course some combos that will work at higher Dexterity, and some that won't if the Dexterity is too low. Neutral Light into Side Light, for instance, is a combo that doesn't work on lower Dexterity values and works on higher ones, but this is only at lower damages and is really situational. Next up we have the Sword. Sword is a pretty quick and combo-heavy weapon with a plethora of conversions and kill confirms. It's seen a lot of top-level representation, including Bodvar, Hattori, Asuri, Koji, Jala, Val, and Jae-yun. It's been an incredibly consistent presence at the top level, and is still an excellent weapon even after all of these years. It has dexterity values ranging from 3 to 9. Sword has decent startup on all of its grounded moves. Neutral Light, Downlight, and Ground Pound change their active frames whenever making contact with an opponent, with Neutral Light and Downlight converting into a second hit after the initial one makes contact, and Ground Pound's hitboxes cancelling after making contact with the opponent. On miss, we can see that all of the moves on Sword's kit have lower end lag the higher the dexterity values, making them slightly safer on miss. These reductions in end lag vary from 1 frame reduction to a 4 frame reduction. On hit, we can see some variation in the FAF, also varying between 2 frames of end lag reduction and 4 frames. Most notably, Downlight retains the same FAF no matter what dexterity you run it on, allowing it to combo into literally every option that a Sword player has with the exception of itself. Also, I want to say that the hitboxes and active frames on Sword's Sidelight are absolutely ridiculous, and I hate them. That is all. Sword has pretty consistent grounded and aerial conversions thanks to its wide and sweeping hitboxes and relatively good end lag. It's a solid weapon with great kill confirms and is an excellent secondary weapon on any toolkit. Certain combos are true on higher dexterities, as is the case with most weapons, but I think that most of the more practically applicable combos in matches are useful even on lower dexterities. There are obviously legend-specific cases where higher dexterity results in signature combos, but I'm not covering that here. I think that Sword is a good weapon that benefits slightly from dexterity, and whenever looking at the competitively used Sword legends, the primary ones are higher dexes like Koji and Asuri, but Jae-yun is frequently ran at lower dex stats, so feel free to make your own judgments about that, though that could just be because of Greatsword. Now for the blasters. Blasters have been up and down in the metagame, and utilize a heavy zoning and spacing gameplay. Characters like Cassidy, Lucian, Diana, Barraza, and Cross have seen some pretty solid competitive results, though they do fade in and out of the metagame. They aren't super popular in the meta right now, but I anticipate that they will be at some point again. Blasters' legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 9. Blasters rely pretty heavily on maintaining space and stage control, as several of its moves are disjointed and do not connect with the opponent at a point-blank range. This is especially true of Sidelight and the aerials. They have okay startup, and FAFs on some of the moves are pretty high considering their multi-hit nature, but I suppose that's why it requires such precise spacing, so don't miss. I'd say that Sidelight is probably the best spacing tool, and it has the lowest amount of FAF on hit. Neutral Light, Down Air, and Ground Pound all have different active frames based on whether they make contact or not, adding an additional hit after the initial ones. On miss, all moves end lag is reduced as the dexterity value increases, varying from 1 frame to 4 frame reductions. On hit, most of the moves decrease their end lag as dexterity goes up, with the exception of 3. Sidelight, Neutral Air, and Down Air all have the same FAF no matter what dexterity you run them on, and on the other moves they vary from a 1 frame to a 3 frame reduction. Most of the moves on hit on the Blaster's toolkit that you would combo out of or into have very little variation between their 3 dexterity and their 9 dexterity counterparts. Neutral Light only being 1 frame, Downlight being only 1 frame, Cider being only 2 frames, Recovery being 2 frames, and Ground Pound being 3 frames. But let's be real, you aren't comboing out of Ground Pound most of the time. A lot of Blaster's combos come from Downlight, Sidelight, Down Air, or Neutral Light, which all have incredibly low variation between their dexterities. Not to mention that the Downlight Recovery Kill Confirm works on all dexterity values as well. I'm sure that there are some combos that are true based on that 1 frame difference, but I'd wager it's not many and not necessarily worth investing in. It seems that of the weapons that we've covered so far, that Blasters have the lowest variation in FAF based on dexterity. On miss there is some variation, but it's not that much safer and still requires well-placed spacing. And on hit there are very few moves that have a significant change in their FAF, so honestly I don't think that dex is worth running on Blasters, and you're better off investing in a stat point that's more beneficial. Up next is the Rocket Lance, one of my least favorite weapons in the game. It's pretty heavily disregarded in the competitive scene most of the time, and many professionals consider the weapon considerably weaker than the others, which I would personally disagree with given the competitive results that they've displayed in the past year or so, though I will say that these results have mostly been confined to Orion, Ulgrim, and Scarlet. Rocket Lance legends have varying dexterity values between 2 and 9. Several of Rocket Lance's moves are different on miss than on hit, with Neutral Light gaining additional active frames upon making contact with an opponent. Recovery and Ground Pound cancels their hitboxes upon making contact with an opponent. On miss, we can see that all of the moves have reduced end lag as dexterity increases, varying from a 1 frame reduction to a 4 frame reduction in FAF. On hit, we see that most of the moves reduce their FAF as dexterity increases, with the exception of Sidelight. The moves vary in end lag reduction from a 1 frame to a 3 frame reduction on hit. Additionally, down air functions differently based on where you initiate the move. If performed close to the ground, the hitboxes will adjust to grounded version, which adjusts the active frame duration as well as the end lag that the move has. The version that connects into the ground has 2 less active frames and has between 5 and 8 frames less of end lag. The mechanics surrounding the down air on Rocket Lance and several other weapons are really interesting and function differently based on their proximity to the ground. The startup on Rocket Lance's moves is about average, I'd say. Its light attack startup is pretty good, but aerial startup is slightly slower. It has some of the best disjointed hitboxes in the entire game in my opinion though, and can outrange a plethora of moves from other weapons if challenged at a distance. I think Rocket Lance is a very linear weapon, but still a really solid one, much to my dismay. Its frame data is slightly slower than some of the other weapons in terms of startup and FAF, which makes sense given its immense size, range, and hitbox sizes, but I think that it still functions well at what it does, but it does have its disadvantageous matchups. I honestly don't think that running dexterity is necessary on Rocket Lance, which is kind of reinforced by Ulgrim's high placing competitive results as of late. Some combos are true on higher decks, I'm sure, but it doesn't appear that it's made a significant impact to the Rocket Lance's competitive presence. Spear is the next weapon on our list. It's the most flowchart weapon in the game, and has been used to great success at top level with legends like Orion, Nash, Hattori, Bryn, Wushang, and Kaya. Its combo routes are fairly simplistic, and deal out massive amounts of damage if the proper read is made. Spear legends have varying dexterity values from 2 to 8. Some moves function differently on miss than they do on hit, with down light adding some additional active frames after the initial hit, and down air cancelling its remaining hitboxes upon making contact with the opponent. On miss, we can see the end lag on all of the moves is decreased, varying from 1 frame to a 4 frame reduction in FAF. On hit, we see that most of the moves reduce their end lag as dexterity goes up, with the exception of Sidelight and Downlight. The other moves vary in end lag reduction from 2 frames to 4 frames of the FAF. We can see that 2 of the primary tools used in Spear's combo routes in Sidelight and Downlight have 0 variation in FAF based on dexterity on hit, ensuring that all combo routes out of Sidelight or Downlight are applicable on all dexterity values so long as the proper reads are made. There aren't a huge amount of true combos on Spear, and I think that the only one that really is impacted by dexterity may be Side Air into Neutral Light, but other than that, Spear isn't really heavily reliant on true combos, and I don't think that it's super necessary to run dexterity on Spear, given its typical combo routes, and you wouldn't be missing much in my opinion. Though, that being said, I don't know all of the combos for Seer, so I could be missing some of them. It's got really good priority thanks to its disjointed hitboxes like Neutral Light, and Downline excels at catching jumps. It's got good option coverage for just about every situation, and has a really solid place in the competitive metagame, and I think that it's a good weapon for anyone to invest time in. Now for my favorite weapon, the Katars. As much as professional players will place these weapons in mid-tier, they still certainly see a lot of competitive play. Mako, Lin Fei, Ragnar, Ember, Sentinel, Lucian, and especially Asuri have all seen good competitive results, and I'd wager will continue to do so in the future. Their combo game, damage output, and frame data, as you'll see, make them a viable threat at all levels of play. Katar legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 9. Katars rely on a quick flurry of attacks, heavily punishing an opponent's dodge or misplaced approach option. The half-pipe is one of my favorite things to do in the game, and deals a huge amount of damage to an opponent. Some of the moves on the toolkit function differently on miss than on hit. Neutral Light extends its initial hit and adds another to it, and Ground Pound cancels on the first frame that it makes contact with an opponent. The startup on Katars is really good, especially on its light attacks, and this is even after the nerf in patch 5.07 that increased time to hit on downlight from frame 5 to 6. Though this did make several combos not true on Katars if you aren't running the highest dexterity in the game. Down air to downlight, for instance. On average, it has the fastest startup in any weapon in the game, followed by Unarmed, though this makes sense given the very small disjoints that Katars actually have. The hitboxes on Katars are pretty small, honestly, and while not bad, certainly do not offer the same coverage options as other weapons. On Miss, we see that every move reduces its FAF as the dexterity value goes up, varying from a 1 frame reduction to a 3 frame reduction in FAF, and recovery has the same FAF on all dexterity values. On hit, we see this vary a little bit, varying from a 1 frame reduction to a 3 frame reduction. Some combos are significantly more difficult to escape the higher your dexterity values, and I think that Katars are one of the few weapons where it can make a reasonable difference, especially given how much damage Katars get off of moves like Sidelight into Neutral Light, and this is coming from a guy that runs a 4 dex on Caspian. Though it isn't absolutely necessary. You can see effective competitive results with both Sentinel and Mako, who both also run 4 dexterity. Down air functions similarly to the way that Rocket Lance's down air does, where it will cancel if you make contact with the ground. So the active frames will vary based on when and where you start the move. As such, the FAF also varies based on how you hit it. If you hit the aerial version and carry it all the way through, then you have more end lag than you would should you hit the grounded version, but each one has its uses and certain combo potential. I don't think that dexterity is absolutely essential to run on Katars, but it also doesn't hurt, I suppose, and can make your combos tighter to dodge. Certain combos like side light dash down light or side light neutral light, for instance. And that being said, the most common Katars legend used at top level competitive play is Asuri, who has remarkably high dexterity, so that could be some indication that it's slightly more important on Katars than on other weapons. Now I'm just waiting on BMG to drop a good Katar Scythe legend that looks really cool. Any minute now. Axe is up next. This is also one of my least favorite weapons in the game, and it has a pretty solid placement in the competitive meta, unfortunately. I think that all of the Axe legends have been used at high levels of competitive play at one point or another, maybe with the exception of Volkov, at least in ones, and Rayman is considered one of the best legends in the game at the time of writing, so they aren't hurting at all in the competitive metagame right now. Axe legends have varying dexterity values from 2 to 9. Only one of Axe's moves functions differently on miss than it does on hits, with Neutral Light adding an extra hit after the initial one if the move makes contact. The startup on Axe's moves are slightly above average, so a little bit slower, and deal a pretty large amount of damage and knockback. On miss, we see that every move reduces its end lag as the dexterity increases, varying from a 2 frame to a whopping 6 frame difference on FAF. On hit, we can see that all of the moves are reduced in terms of their end lag with the exception of Sidelight, which is universally locked at a 32 frame FAF for all dexterity values. Additionally, when down air is performed low to the ground, it results in an extended amount of active frames, and it also locks the FAF at 34 for all dexterities, resulting in an excellent combo starter no matter what legend you're running. There's a 1 to 4 frame difference in FAF on the other moves as the dexterity stat increases. I'm slightly surprised by the FAF reduction, honestly, but still don't think that it's super essential. Even down air, which is a great combo tool for Axe, isn't impacted and doesn't impede on its combo ability even at lower dexterities. I think dexterity on Axe isn't needed, at least for its combo ability. It may be needed for some combos on specific legends, but I'm not sure. I'm just here to detail the frame data. But the light attack combos won't have much variation on dexterity, in my opinion. Up next is Bow, which has been a pretty solid competitively viable weapon for the past few years, and is still pretty viable even after the nerfs from patch 5.07. It's still got really good range and option coverage coupled with excellent juggling capabilities. I think that most Bow legends have had a decent competitive presence in the game's lifespan, well with the exception of Zariel and Vector. Bow legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 9. Several moves on Bow function differently on miss than on hit. Sidelight, Ground Pound, and Neutral Air each add extra hitboxes to their initial move, while Recovery functions as a command grab. Bow has a mixed bag in terms of startup. Neutral Light, Sidelight, and Neutral Air have pretty decent startup, and others are slightly slower. Downlight has the highest amount of startup on all of Bow's kit, but given its range coverage and mobility, this makes sense. We can see that on miss, as the dexterity goes up, the FAF on all of the moves goes down, varying between 2 and 3 frames of reduction in end lag. On hit, we see that most of the moves reduce their FAF as the dexterity increases, with the exception of Sidelight, varying between a 1 frame and a 3 frame reduction on end lag. Down air functions comparably to Rocket Lance and Katars, where if the hitbox makes contact with the ground, it cancels. This in turn has an impact on the end lag that the move has, as well as the active frames, oddly enough. If performed at the lowest possible spacing before it cancels into a downlight, the active frames come out 2 frames earlier than if spaced higher, while still ending the active frames on the same frame and with a 1 frame less end lag than if performed higher up, though the version spaced lower only yields splatter hitboxes along the ground as opposed to aerial ones, which is an interesting interaction and alteration to the move. Combos out of Sidelight on bow will always be consistent and need some reads as most weapons do, and I think that bow legends can benefit from higher dexterities, but I don't think that it's absolutely necessary, and I think that after 5 dex you may not get much additional benefit out of it. Though it is worth noting that almost all of the competitively used legends have 5 dex or higher with the exception of Kaya, and while I don't think that their dexterity is the primary factor when comparing their competitive success, it is at least worth mentioning. I don't know and haven't labbed out which combos are true based on these variations and which aren't, but I think that bow's combo strings are really good, and I think that they're made a little tighter with higher dexterities of course, but I think that running a little bit lower is fine option too. Besides, you have options on bow legends at a variety of dexterities, so pick whichever you feel has the easiest conversion options for you, because there are plenty of viable picks. Now for Gauntlets. This weapon is incredibly prevalent in the competitive landscape currently with no signs of slowing down. A shrewd combination of exceptional follow-up options and edgeguarding potential. Core, Wushang, Val, Mordex, Rayman, Petra, and Onyx have all been and continue to be competitively viable and used at high-level competitive play. Gauntlet legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 8. Gauntlets have reasonable startup and active frames on most of their moves, being under 13 frames on everything with the exception of Ground Pound. Neutral Light, Side Air, and Down Air function differently on miss than they do on hit. On hit, an extra hit or multiple hits is added after the initial hitboxes come out, and Neutral Air functions as a command grab on hit which sends the opponent downward. All of Gauntlet's aerials send the opponent downward, setting up for conversions into themselves and for excellent edgeguarding options. We can see that on miss, all of the moves reduce their end lag, varying between a 1 frame difference to a 3 frame difference in FAF. Additionally, Neutral Air has no variation in FAF based on dexterity on miss, which is an interesting factor because it's not the same case on hit. On hit, we see that there's very little dexterity variation between moves at lower dexterity and higher dexterity, with Sidelight, Downlight, and Side Air not having any variation based on dex, and the remaining moves having 1 frame differences with the exception of Ground Pound. This surprised me a little bit honestly, and it seems to me that dexterity is pretty wasted on Gauntlet legends. I know how good Wushang is, but it's absolutely not because of dexterity on Gauntlets, that's for sure. You can perform most, if not all of the important combos on Gauntlets with the lowest dexterity values, which is pretty apparent by how low Mordex's dexterity is and his continued success in competitive play. I'd say invest your stat points into another stat personally, assuming it isn't beneficial for your character's secondary weapon or signature combos. Next is Scythe. Scythe has been a pretty consistent presence in the metagame, Mordex obviously leading the charge on this one, but we've also seen competitive results from characters like Fate, Jiro, and Nyx. One of the harder weapons to learn in terms of execution, but one of the most satisfying to land combos with in my opinion. Scythe legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 9. Several of Scythe's moves function differently on miss than on hit. Sidelight and Recovery add extra active frames should the move make contact, and Downlight, Neutral Air, and Down Air function as command grabs if they connect. Scythe is very heavily known for its active input commands, and in terms of frame data this is no different, as each variation of the attack offers different end lag and FAF on it. Sidelight has 2 variations, Downlight has 2 variations, Neutral Air has 2 variations, and Down Air has 2 variations, which offers Scythe probably the most options in terms of combo routes of any weapon in the game. On this Excel spreadsheet, the neutral input is listed first, and the active input is listed second. In terms of startup, the Scythe hovers around average, and on miss we can see that every move on the kit reduces its FAF as dexterity goes up with the exception of Neutral Air. On hit we can see some of the most consistent frame data of any weapon in the game alongside probably Cannon, with Neutral Light, Sidelight, both variations, and Side Air all having the same FAF no matter the dexterity, and the remaining moves only changing in FAF by 1 or 2 frames with the exception of Ground Pound, which is 3 frames. Given Scythe's quick combo game and heavy strings, I honestly expected dexterity to have a larger impact on Scythe's FAF than it does. After seeing this information, I really don't think that running dexterity on Scythe is needed at all. Sure, it helps you to be a little bit safer on miss, but that's true of any dexterity stat, and it's not that much safer that it's worth sacrificing a point in another stat. And upon seeing this, it's easy to see how Mordex is capable of performing so well at competitive level despite his really low dexterity. I personally wouldn't run dexterity on Scythe under any circumstances. Cannon is next on our list. The competitive landscape has had some pretty good competition from Cannon in the past few years, with all 5 of the Cannon legends being used at top-level competitive play in some way, with Onyx recently displaying quite a bit of competitive viability in the recent tournaments. I gotta say though, for the love of God I cannot use this weapon to save my life, and I cannot get the spacing down at all. Cannon legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 9. Neutral Light and Ground Pound function differently on hit than they do on miss, with Neutral Light adding a second hit to the initial one and Ground Pound reducing some of its initial active frames. Startup on cannon is slightly above average, with the active frames starting a little bit later than the standard with the heavy hitting attacks that it has. On miss, we can see that every move has reduced FAF as the dexterity of the user increases, with the exception of Neutral Air, which is locked at 40 frames for all dexterities on miss. On hit, all of Cannon's light attacks have the same FAF regardless of dexterity, with Neutral Light, Side Light, and Down Light being locked in at 52, 32, and 31 frames of FAF respectively. Additionally, Down Air also has the same FAF for all dexterity values. The remaining moves have variation between a 1 frame and a 3 frame reduction in end lag as the dexterity increases. Overall, for the cannon, I think that it isn't necessary to run dexterity given that most of its combo routes are based out of moves with little to no variation in end lag based on dexterity. This is also supported by the fact that Onyx is currently the best performing cannon legend and she only has a dexterity value of 4. I think that Cannon is a solid weapon still and will continue to perform well, but I do not recommend running dexterity on it at all, especially since all of its light attacks don't change with dexterity variation. Now for the Orb. This weapon has had some pretty solid competitive results, with Fate, Thor, and Petra being premier users of the weapon in a tournament setting. It got a decent nerf recently in patch 5.07 shortly after Reno's addition to the game. Orb Legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 8. The only move on Orb's kit that behaves differently on hit than it does on miss is Side Air, which converts into a second hit after the initial one makes contact. The startup on Orb is about average or slightly above. On miss, we can see that all of the moves have decreased end lag as dexterity increases, and on hit we see that Neutral Light, Side Light, Down Light, and Side Air all have uniformly locked FAF regardless of dexterity. The remaining moves vary from a 1 frame reduction to a 2 frame reduction in FAF on hit. One weird thing about Orb is Down Air. This move has so many variations, it's nuts, and I honestly hate it from a frame data perspective. The aerial version descends diagonally downward in a straight line in a similar manner to Bow, but then you have a version where if performed close enough to the ground, the orb will bounce off of the ground and connect with an opponent, and then there is also a version performed even closer to the ground, where the legend will do a handspring and then the hitbox will come out. And we also have a version where if performed against a wall, the orb bounces off the wall, so we have a lot of different versions with different active frames and hitboxes that are frankly kind of wild to me, and I'm not going to list every single variation of this here since it would be too much. However, I'll briefly discuss each variation of the move and the general trend of the dexterity for each. The active frames as well vary based on the proximity to the ground. What I've found is two things. The aerial version and the version where your character performs the handspring have comparable FAF but slightly different active frames. The version that is slightly more above the ground that bounces is interesting because the FAF on this one is about 5 frames or so lower than the other two variations, which offers you some incredible mix-up opportunities because of the differences in active frames, which is really great utility for a down air that functions as a projectile and bounces away from you. It functions like a better and slightly slower version of bow down air that has utility in several situations. Lastly, it bounces off of walls as well, making it incredibly versatile and useful for edge guarding and is kind of a ridiculous option, honestly. The pure function and variation of this move is insane, but I suppose that's one of the things that makes Orb unique. Orb is doing well competitively, or at least it was before the nerfs. What happens now remains to be seen. And all of the competitively viable Orb legends recently, Petra, Thor, and Fate, all have dexterity values of 4 and are never run with a dex boosting stance, so take that for what you will. After the nerfs to the toolkit, this may change, but we'll have to wait and see. Until then, I think that it isn't necessary to run dex on Orb at all. We're almost done. The second to last weapon is the Greatsword. This weapon is still one of the best in the whole game, and was easily the best whenever it was added to the game. It was heavily nerfed in subsequent patches, but still has seen excellent competitive results post-nerf, and I still think that Jae-Yun and Mako are two of the strongest legends in the game. Greatsword legends have varying dexterity values from 3 to 6, and have the lowest variation in dexterity values, though this is no surprise considering it's the newest weapon. Greatsword, I think, is the only weapon that yields the same active frames on miss as it does on hit for every move. One thing about this weapon, however, is that each of the grounded light attacks, neutral, side, and down, convert into either neutral, side, or down bridges, which then convert into closers. Startup on Greatsword's attacks are slightly above average, but have pretty good range and priority given their large hitboxes. The FAFs on light attacks are pretty high for the light attacks, but they convert into bridges and subsequent finishers at much earlier frames, which are indicated by the glint that appears above the character's head. So I'll list both the frames that convert into the bridges as well as the actual FAF for the move, with the actual FAF listed first. It's also worth noting that the frames at which the character can perform a bridge are also capable of performing a chase dodge as well. Additionally, all of Greatsword's aerials convert into their light attack bridges. So on the aerials, there is an FAF if performed aerially, an FAF if performed close to the ground, and a bridge conversion frame. So for the aerials, I'm only going to list the aerial FAF and the bridge conversion frame if performed close to the ground. On miss, we can see that every light attack has the same FAF regardless of the dexterity stat, and the same with the bridge frame, and the remaining moves drop by 1 or 2 frames in terms of FAF as dexterity goes up, though the aerials still have the same bridge conversion frame regardless of dexterity as well. This is applicable to moves on hit as well, with the light attack FAFs being locked no matter the dexterity stat, and the bridge frames remaining constant yet slightly lower than the bridge conversion frames on miss. Again, we can see that the legends that primarily are successful with this weapon have lower dexterity stats and run a minus dex stance to ensure that they have added benefits in other stats. The bridge connections and huge sweeping hitboxes on this move definitely help it to be successful despite its slower frame data. It's a great weapon despite the nerfs it received a few patches ago, and I think that it will still make waves in the competitive scene for the foreseeable future. Lastly is Unarmed, the only universal kit in the entire game. It's honestly not a bad toolkit, and it functions well for what it does. It's got some great combos, especially off of Downlight, and should not be underestimated. I'll be including the heavy attacks for this as well, since those haven't been covered in any of my previous videos. Unarmed legends have varying dexterity values from 2 to 9. Some of the moves function differently on miss than they do on hit. Neutral Light and Neutral Air gain active frames upon making contact with the opponent. Ground Pound's active frames are reduced to just the frame that makes contact with the opponent. Down Air alters its hitboxes based on how it collides with the opponent, which I'll discuss in more detail shortly, and Down Light has a very unique property where it cancels the hitboxes after it collides with an opponent and only has 4 frames of end lag. This makes Downlight one of the best combo tools in the entire game if it makes contact. It combos into aerials as well as recovery, ground pound, and gravity cancelled neutral stick, making it useful at all damage ranges and excellent at securing stocks. Down aerial functions comparably to Katars or Rocket Lance, where the move cancels upon making contact with the ground, reducing its active frames greatly. We can see on miss that the FAF of all moves are reduced between 1 frame and 4 frames. On hit, their end lag is reduced as well by 3 frames and 4 frames, with the exception of Downlight as discussed previously. The Unarmed toolkit is honestly really not bad. In terms of frame data, it's one of the best in terms of startup and end lag, and I'm rather impressed by it strictly in those terms. What makes the kit struggle is the small hitboxes that provide very little disjoint the same way that the weapons toolkits do, which is why it is typically more advantageous to have a weapon since strings are significantly more consistent on weapons and the larger hitboxes provide for less necessary precision. Given the low end lag on moves on the Unarmed toolkit, I don't think that Dexterity is necessary to use on it, considering the primary combo tool of the Unarmed toolkit is Downlight, which has the same end lag over all dexterities. The remaining moves on the kit are more for chip damage and don't necessarily string into one another in the same way or as consistently as attacks on weapons typically do. It certainly doesn't hurt, but I think that more benefit could be found in strength, defense, or speed given the frame data that Unarmed has even on the lower dexterity values. Phew, alright. I know that was a lot of information, and if you stuck around until the end of this, thank you so much. I know that it was a lot to sit through. And if you don't mind, comment ACE down in the comments, just so I know that people are making it this far. And if you have, here are a couple of codes for you guys, just as a sign of gratitude. Thanks for watching my content. But to sum everything up, Dexterity was honestly better than I had initially thought, though this only applies to specific weapons, which I find to be slightly irritating, just because it doesn't act uniformly across all weapons, which means that you can completely be screwed in terms of stat distribution if you have the wrong weapon combination, but not a big deal I suppose. I think that this isn't the best type of game design for a fighting game. I dislike the ambiguity with which it impacts your character's moveset, and how it doesn't impact some moves at all and impacts others greatly. This means that the available interactions that you can have are significantly higher than they would be if Dex didn't exist, because it makes some things true and some things not true depending on what you're running, and I personally am not a fan of this. I don't think that giving the player the ability to adjust the end lag on their moves is a good call, especially whenever it isn't made clear how much it impacts the frame data, doesn't impact all of them in the same way, and is the least intuitive of the 4 stat modifiers. Speed, strength, and defense offer pretty clear-cut information in regards to what they will do, while Dexterity is both vague about what it actually does and how much of it does. You could run a 9 dex versus a 2 dex and have 1 frame less end lag on one move and 4 frames less of end lag on another move, at the cost of another stat, mind you. I just personally am not a fan of this design, and I still think that I'd rather run any other stat than Dexterity with just about any weapon that I'm using. I'm not an expert on combos or anything, but I just don't think that the benefits from running higher Dexterity outweigh the sacrifices in another stat, though of course there are exceptions. In my original video, I said that Dexterity was useless, and while it was better than I had originally thought, I still think that it is, honestly. If we're looking at what's competitively relevant right now, there's very little need for it given the data I've presented. Greatsword doesn't need it. Gauntlets don't need it. Axe doesn't need it. Sword, you could probably make an argument for Sword given that most of the meta-relevant sword characters have average or above Dexterity. Scythe doesn't need it. Bow and Katars could probably also make an argument for being somewhat useful. But the rest of them? Not worth it in my opinion. That's 3 out of the 14 weapons, including Unarmed, that can slightly benefit from running higher Dexterity. And in my opinion, that's still a pretty useless stat modifier. That pretty much sums up my thoughts on this, so I hope this has been helpful for you guys and informative for everyone. Once again, I'm Cobalt, and thanks for watching.